been fighting a long time, and we have all lost so very much, so many loved ones gone. But you are not alone. There are pockets of resistance all around the planet. We are at the brink. You have no idea how important you are. If you're listening to this, you are the resistance.
All right, welcome to our Zoom presentations for Wednesday evenings, Wednesday night at the parish. We have these Zoom presentations, both giving meditations as well as sometimes updates on the most recent developments regarding the protocols of our good bishop. But yes, last week we decided to discuss a very timely topic, namely the notion of vaccines because of the COVID-19 situation and the fact that, having read some of those headlines from last week, that we have 300 million potential vaccination shots being developed, hopefully available, they're saying, by January 2021. And so vaccines become sort of a topic that I think a lot of people want to discuss, or at least be to have more explanations given to them regarding this topic. And so, again, we have Pam Acker with us from last week. This is sort of part two. And I do want to do a couple of things. First of all, again, remember COVID-19 from last week. I read some headlines from the newspapers. The notion that the president has had an Operation Warp Speed, sort of the military's involved to try to deliver this vaccine as quickly as possible. And as I stated, 300 million vaccines supposedly by January of 2021. There's supposedly been developments in certain pharmaceutical companies, in particular Moderna, which suggests that there's been successful initial testing so far. And so a lot of people are really pushing for the vaccines to be the answer to the COVID-19 issue. And that's sort of how we live in many ways. We can't fully open up until we have the vaccine. That's how many people are thinking. But I do want to just go back to last week, and Pam will also we'll both provide some clarifications. Last week we mentioned the notion of unethical versions of vaccines that are derived in some way by the cells of aborted fetuses, the fetal tissues. And so we obviously read the Pontifical Academy of Life document, and this obviously condemns that entire notion of deriving these vaccines from unethical aborted fetuses. But I think sometimes when people read the headlines a few years ago when that document came out, the headline ended up being, even in the Catholic press, the Catholic Church accepts the use of vaccines, even if they come from these illicit, unethical sources. And that is not what the Pontifical Academy for Life states. It's an extremely, completely negative evaluation of the entire process. And so it's saying, obviously, those who were part of developing the vaccine using fetal tissue from aborted fetuses, for those who are marketing, for those who develop pharmaceutical companies, for the marketing branch of pharmaceutical companies, for those who are actively involved in a very formal way in promoting this these vaccinations. But even for those who are the parents, who are sort of stuck in many ways with, let's say, only unethical versions of vaccines being available, we find that the Vatican was very, 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 very nuanced in this area. It basically said this: you never want to fully agree to this as being something good that you need for yourself, for your dependents, but your will is never fully agreeing to this as something that is a good, that you're under a certain coercion There's no other vaccines that are ethical available. And so your will has a certain violence being done to it. And so that is what's happening. We're not agreeing to this in a full, pure will sort of way. There's a violence being done to the individual who has to, as a last resort, use this particular vaccine. And so that the church says temporary. This is a temporary sort of situation that the parent is required, duty-bound, to object, that we are all required to object to seek proper, licit versions of vaccines. But then Pam said last week, as you know, it's sort of a perpetuation of this situation that the pharmaceutical companies don't seem particularly pressured to provide ethical versions of vaccines. And so I think we do need to properly object and even not vaccine in some cases as an objection, knowing also that we are called to witness to life in the fullest sense, especially when COVID-19, according to Pam, she said last week, at least 7 or 8, it seems, of the various versions of the COVID-19, SARS-CoV-2 vaccines probably come from aborted fetal tissue lines. So, Pam, I wanted to add that, but let's get back to you. Do you want to bring up any clarifications from last week, particularly maybe how vaccines also work, and to get our terms right?
Sure. I had a couple questions, I guess, in the interim, Father, about the rabies vaccine in particular, and because I had mentioned that it can be used after exposure to rabies is thought to have happened or verified to have happened. And you certainly can't use most vaccines in this way, and this would be a therapeutic use of the vaccine. And so, for example, if you have pertussis, the last thing you would want to do is go into the doctor's office and get a pertussis vaccine. That would actually make your situation worse. And that's the case for most vaccines. You don't want to take them when you're sick. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that at the end. We talk about the ways to hopefully minimize or at least reduce possible damage from vaccines if you have to be vaccinated. But before I go into all of that, I think it would be helpful to talk about how vaccines actually work in the body, because I think there's just a little bit of misunderstanding about that. So just very, very, very basic overview. When you are vaccinated, there's a small amount of weakened disease material, and this might be actually still alive. In this case, it would be something called attenuated. So it's been mutated or weakened in some way so that it doesn't cause a normal standard infection. And then you also have killed vaccines or inactivated vaccines. These are the actual disease material, but they've been inactivated in some way, often with chemicals, sometimes things like formaldehyde. And you also have subunit vaccines. And these are vaccines where you take, as I was explaining to you the other day, Father, you take just a piece of the pathogen and inject that into the body. And these things are all injected intramuscularly. And so it's that weakened disease material or part of the disease that's injected into your muscles. And it's important to note this is not a normal mode of exposure. The normal mode of exposure for most diseases is usually through respiratory or oral routes. And so taking something and injecting it into your muscles is abnormal. And we'll talk a little bit about that again also later in the talk, a little bit more about that. So kind of make a mental note of that. And then the subunit vaccines, the ones that just take a piece of the disease material, are supposed to be safer than the live vaccines, because you can actually contract the disease from somebody who has been vaccinated with a live vaccine. And the live vaccines are the measles, mumps, and rubella, rotavirus, chickenpox, and the oral polio and the nasal influenza vaccines. Those are the ones that you would see commonly in the U.S. at this point. The oral polio that has been suspended in the U.S., but it's still in use around the world and other places. So you can actually contract the disease from vaccinated individuals who become carriers of it, and the vaccinated individuals themselves can contract it. So subunit vaccines were thought to be safer, but this is not necessarily the case because they have something added to them called an adjuvant, and this is I think the Latin word for helper. And these are things that cause your body to have a greater immune response, because they found that since the vaccine wasn't live, it wasn't producing the same amount of antibody response. And so that leads me to the other important part about understanding the way vaccines work, and that's that the measurement of a vaccine's efficacy is the antibody response, and this is supposed to somehow equal immunity. And this kind of leads to a little bit of confusion of terms. We talked about, vaccination is not the same thing as immunization. So when I'm taking this disease material and I'm injecting it intramuscularly, it's not the same thing as being exposed and fighting the disease normally. And partly because of the route of exposure, but partly because the vaccine seems to bypass the innate immune response. And this is the reaction that you have to a disease that actually is what makes you feel sick. It's not the disease itself or the pathogen itself. It's usually your immune response that causes, the fever and the kind of nausea or tiredness or things like that are normally associated with being sick. And the vaccine also primes the body in favor of a B cell response instead of a T cell response. And we can maybe put a bookmark here as well, because this is very important in the mediation of autoimmune pathology, which we're going to talk about later. So B cells produce a lot of antibodies, and that can be really important in the development of autoimmune disease. And so all of this can kind of dramatically affect how the body responds to future pathogens. So if I'm taking this sort of abnormal route of exposure, I can change the way that the body responds to disease, and that's something that isn't talked about as much as just the protective effect of trying to sort of train the body to recognize a particular disease. And so that's just a little bit about how vaccines work, and hopefully that was reasonably understandable. But that brings me to the rabies vaccine, which is actually a vaccine. It is that disease material. It's one of the inactivated vaccines that's then injected into the body. And if you are exposed to rabies, and I looked up the number of deaths from rabies per year in the US, it's about 1 to 3 deaths per year at this point. But about 30 to 60,000 people are treated for possible exposure to rabies every year. So our method of treatment is actually quite good. Even if you assume only about 1% of those possible exposures are actual exposures, our treatment rates are still extremely excellent if only 1 to 3 deaths are actually occurring per year. So the rabies vaccine is actually part of the treatment for rabies. And it's going to induce the body to mount an immune response to the rabies virus by exposing the body to that inactivated rabies virus that's in the vaccine. And the reason that this works is because rabies is different than a lot of the other infectious diseases that we would vaccinate for. And it has an incubation period between several weeks to several months, depending on where the rabies exposure happens. If you're bitten in an extremity, it takes longer for it to develop than if you're bitten in your core. So this is an example of a reasonable use of a vaccine. It's a therapeutic use instead of a prophylactic use, and so that's where I think the part of the confusion is happening too, because most vaccines are prophylactic, which is basically a techie science word for saying that they're things that you would do in advance of a possible exposure. So this is not a treatment for a disease, but it's a method of preventing the disease. So vaccines are not all prophylactic, as we just saw, and all prophylaxis is not vaccines. So we don't want to confuse those two terms, kind of like we don't want to confuse vaccination and immunization. They're two separate things. But it would be reasonable to use the rabies vaccine prophylactically if you're in a situation where you might be exposed to rabies quite a bit. Say if you work in wildlife removal and you are in danger on a relatively frequent basis of possibly getting bit by a raccoon who, you know, would possibly carry rabies. I mean, there are times when it is reasonable to try to prevent the possible onset of a disease. But I know some folks were a little bit worried. Nobody in the parish probably needs to rush out and get a rabies vaccine. I think it's fairly safe to say the likelihood of you contracting rabies or dying of it if you did contract it is extremely, extremely low. So that was the clarification I wanted to make sure I issued there.
Thank you, Pam. So just to sort of look at that just a little bit, so the rabies vaccine, there are ethical versions of that vaccine, right?
That's right. That's right. I forgot to mention that. I'm sorry, Father. And I was even sort of frantically pulling up the document as you were doing your introduction because I remembered I forgot it at that point. But the rabies vaccine came up last week because it is one of the vaccines that is made using aborted fetal cells. But it's a specific brand of the rabies vaccine that's made that way. And the trade name is Imovax, and that's by Sanofi Pasteur. And it's made using the MRC5 aborted fetal cell line. But there is an ethical alternative, and that alternative is called Rabivert. And that's made by GlaxoSmithKline, and that's made in egg cells. And so all of that information is available on the Children of God for Life website. If you go to their website, they have a vaccines tab, and under that tab, they have a vaccine chart, and that gives you just a simple one-page PDF format of all of the vaccines that are made in aborted fetal cells, as well as any ethical alternatives that are available in the US or internationally.
And I guess I would also add that you had told me that, you know, rabies is can be deadly. I mean, it's 100% if it's not treated, basically.
Well, it's pretty close to 100%. There have been documented cases of once you develop symptoms of rabies, there are about 20 cases. Once you develop symptoms of rabies, you don't die. And that was something I didn't know. I learned that when I was looking up more about the rabies vaccine and rabies in general this week. So it's possible that you wouldn't die, but it's highly unlikely once you develop symptoms.
So you can see the need for an intervention in a therapeutic way of this vaccine.
Oh, absolutely.
But chickenpox is generally not obviously a deadly thing. So to compare the two vaccines, it doesn't seem appropriate. I think vaccines are all good, including the chickenpox, and because it can save lives.
Right. Yeah. We don't want to necessarily use the rabies vaccine example to justify all vaccines or the phenomenon of prophylactic vaccination in general, simply because it is an exceptional case. It's not the norm that we would see with the diseases that we're trying to prevent using vaccines.
Good. So now that we have sort of looked at that as sort of a clarification from last week, I think we want to go into a little bit of the ideology behind the notion of vaccinations, especially the ideology that would drive us to think that we truly cannot get back to normal life in our country and in the world until a vaccine is developed and distributed. So obviously some major ideology is driving that mindset. So in looking at these things, I sort of felt that maybe some of the principles of the Enlightenment could have contributed to this mindset regarding the ideology of vaccinating. So I'm just going to go through that just a quick bit here. Again, an ideology is almost like it's a set of ideas, and so it's almost like doctrinaire. It's like a religion being applied to even and the notion of something secular. Ideologues oftentimes are unbending individuals. They don't compromise regarding many things. They can be moralizers. They are doing good for humanity, good for you, good for your family, good for all of humanity. Listen to us because we're more enlightened than you are. And resistance is futile. And put a flag next to that because we'll get to that too. The desire, and this is part of the Enlightenment, we're talking about, the 17th century, 18th century, 19th century sort of series of philosophies in connection with the Enlightenment. The notion that somehow part of the Enlightenment was the desire to transform nature,
Right.
to make it better, somehow improve humanity by applying human reason alone. And part of that is that we would ultimately become masters of nature, so that we could sort of manipulate the nature of things to suit our ambitions. The Age of the Enlightenment, also known as the Age of Reason. It was an intellectual and philosophical movement that dominated the world for those 3 or 4 centuries, but the ideas are still there.
Right.
The Enlightenment included a range of ideas centered on the sovereignty of reason and the evidence of the senses as the primary sources of knowledge, and advanced the ideas of liberty and progress and toleration and brotherhood amongst men, constitutional government, etc., etc. As for the Enlightenment conception of the universe and of nature, it was purely seen as rationally ordered, as if nature and the universe were like a machine. And if it were like a machine, it can be altered, it can be sort of played with just a bit. Again, for the Enlightenment thinker, reason is always the only source of authority. We can remake the world, we can remake nature, we can recreate humanity. That's the mindset. Because of the influence of the Enlightenment, man saw himself largely as separated from his earthly created environment, as if he were somehow outside of nature. The Empire of Reason brought about this enlightenment in regards to dealing with nature, to manipulate nature, alter it, even abuse nature according to the mind of man. And if mankind was separated from the natural world, which Enlightenment thinkers thought, then we could in fact mistreat, torture it, nature, and radically change it according to human whims. The famous Enlightenment thinker, one of the most famous, a guy named Francis Bacon, thought that, quote, the scientist must steal, mind you, the secrets of nature in Promethean fashion, as Prometheus stole fire from the gods. You have to sort of torture nature to get its secrets, interrogate it and torture it. Furthermore, Bacon felt that the torture of nature had to be employed as one would compel an unwilling witness to reveal what he had been concealing. Bleach that white flour. Refine that sugar. Genetically modify that organism by fooling around with the DNA. Make a girl into a boy. Destroy the marital act through contraception. Sterilize healthy, productive, reproductive organs. Replace the natural with the artificial. Replace the organic with the processed. Don't just be a good steward over nature, but rather be a mad scientist who can denature something and then form a new nature. Make a designer baby with pre-selected genes and have the body beautiful. Form your own Frankenstein monster. Or perhaps capture the secrets of the atom and make weapons of mass destruction to use against civilian populations. The primitive savage, the uneducated people, the unenlightened, simply accepts their natural environment as something given to them. But the enlightened man transforms the environment according to his mind. The famous mathematicians, physicist and astronomer, famous man Isaac Newton, viewed the universe and nature again as if they were like machines that can be studied, fooled with, and even altered. And if this is true, why not fool with and even alter the created human nature that the good Lord gave us? Why not accelerate evolution just a bit? The enlightened person would say, maybe eliminated the tainted gene pool from the population with a little bit of eugenics until we can form that perfect man, that Aryan race, that transhuman who is on the road to post-human existence. So that was my long-winded sort of statement against the Enlightenment. Not so enlightened, really. But Pam, having introduced that, you're really very, very well-read and a thinker regarding the era of evolution. But maybe you could take the era of evolution and sort of bring it into the notion of vaccines.
Sure, Father. And I appreciate your shout out to Star Trek there, by the way, with the resistance is futile. Yeah, so I really do think that one very integral and of course I think probably often overlooked key to why the vaccination continues to be employed despite failing on the promises that we were talking about last week. It fails to fully protect the individuals for long term. It certainly fails to protect the society with problems like strain replacement, which are potentially just as problematic as antibiotic resistance, just they're not paid as much attention to. And then of course all of the risks that we're going to look at a little bit later in this talk. One of the reasons that we keep using it is it's very rooted in this modern evolutionary understanding of medicine. And so there's two basic worldviews that one can subscribe to, and the first is often when I work with the Kolbe Center, it's described as the creation providence framework. Basically, we can believe that man's body, as made by God, truly has a marvelous design, and all of the parts of it are ordered to the whole. And so this is really the framework that inspired some of the best minds in natural science, and William Harvey in particular, who discovered the circulation of the blood, discovered it because he was looking for purposiveness in the systems that he was studying. Michael Faraday hypothesized about the unity of electromagnetic forces because of his understanding of the Trinity and the unity within the three persons in God. And of course there are other scientists like Blessed Nicholas Steno, who really developed geography, and Carl Linnaeus, who developed the taxonomic classification system that we use now. These men were all working under this framework that one of the key features of it is this idea of an Aristotelian idea of the final cause. This idea that things are ordered towards an end and there is purposiveness in nature. And evolution really had to throw that out, because evolution, if you subscribe to the evolutionary framework, you believe that man's body is made by natural selection, and it's a random amalgamation of factors, and that individual parts of it can be manipulated in somewhat without reference to the whole, because they kind of are there by chance, and they may even be leftovers of evolutionary ancestors that we don't really need or use anymore. And so evolution is really rooted in naturalism, which is can be defined as a philosophical belief that everything is going to arise from natural properties and causes, and it immediately excludes or by definition excludes supernatural or spiritual explanations for anything. And then this naturalism logically is going to lead to reductionism, which is basically the idea that you can take a complex phenomenon and explain it in terms of a very much simpler phenomenon. And this it ignores the idea of emergent properties, which is that idea that the whole is more than the sum of its parts. And we know that in a living thing, the whole is more than the sum of its parts, because if I put all of the parts of a bacteria together in a test tube, it will not spontaneously self-assemble into a bacteria or bacterium, to use the proper singular. It just doesn't work that way. There are emergent properties of life, and so reductionism kind of ignores those. And this worldview has very practical consequences, like the myopic focus that we have in drug development now, looking sometimes for single target molecules in the human body that we think is going to treat a disease symptom. And when I teach AP biology, Father, I always like to put up a big picture of signaling networks within cells and show them how one molecule is connected to so many other molecules in the body. And if you're not looking at the whole of that, and you're just looking at that one molecule and saying, okay, I know that this is somehow involved in the disease that I'm working on, so I want to stop or start the functioning of this particular molecule. Well, if I change that one thing in the middle of this giant network, I'm going to change the whole network. And we talked a little bit about that with the idea of ecosystem biology last week. We talked about strain replacement. You can't just sort of pick one part out of the body or one part out of nature and say, if I can manipulate this part as much as I want, and nothing really is going to happen to the rest of it. It's unreasonable. So really from the beginning, the pioneers of vaccination were focused on developing vaccines to combat or prevent specific diseases, and rather than striving to understand the way that the body's immune system worked and work within that framework. So the focus was on the germ and not the body. And there's reductionism in that, but there's also reductionism in this idea that antibodies are considered the equivalent to immunity. I mean, most people don't realize how complex the immune system is and how many different cells and how many different processes are involved in it. And to think that we could just take this single marker and say, okay, if I have this, therefore I'm immune. I mean, there's so many studies that have come out in the recent past showing that we have no real idea how the immune system works, or at least haven't had a real idea for a long time, because things that we thought were just involved in kind of the first line of non-specific defense are actually involved in immunological memory, and there's all this cross connectivity, and you really just can't take out one piece of that and say, okay, this is equal to immunity. And then, of course, we have this idea that without vaccination, our body's going to be unable to face the regular onslaught of pathogens, because, of course, it's all this, naturally selected leftover junk from chimpanzees. So, it may or may not work the way that we would like it to. So really, evolutionary theory influences vaccination quite a bit. And vaccination isn't the first time that modern medicine has attempted to improve on God's design. And I can refer our listeners to Hugh Owen's work, The Negative Impact of the Evolutionary Hypothesis on Scientific Research, which is available on the Kolbe Center's website, and that's kolbecenter.org. And he talks about a number of different ways that evolution has negatively impacted scientific research. So I'm just going to mention two of them because they're relevant to immunology, and I think they're relevant to the discussion about vaccination. And it's the tonsils and the appendix. And so both of these organs were initially thought by evolutionists to be vestigial, and so that means that they're kind of leftover evolutionarily. They don't have a function in our body currently, but they had a function in the past, and we just somehow haven't eliminated them by natural selection yet. And the tonsils are now known to have significant immune function, and so a lot of tonsillectomies were performed in the past because the organs were thought to be useless. And really what this ended up doing was actually stripping patients of their God-given first line of defense of their immune system. Because as I said before, most infections are going to come through the respiratory or through the oral route, and most of that's going to go straight down your throat. So right at the base of your throat are your tonsils. That's your front guard, if you will, for your immune system. And this had a pretty big impact in that people with their tonsils removed, they were more likely to have more serious cases of polio during the polio I don't want to call it an epidemic because there were a lot of other factors that were non-virus oriented, but when there was a problem with paralytic polio in the US, if you had your tonsils removed, you were more likely to have a serious case of it. And just generally, people who keep their tonsils are generally healthier than those who don't. And this has been observed over long-term studies up to 30 years. So the focus of tonsils as being vestigial, as being a sort of these evolutionary leftovers, led to another huge problem, which is the shifting of attention away from the physiological and environmental factors that are responsible for the swelling of the tonsils, which is usually why they got removed. And it's pinning the blame for that condition on the nature of the tonsil itself. And that idea that, that I have to correct what's in the body because what's in the body isn't good enough or doesn't work right is something we see still in vaccination. And of course, appendix was also similar, was regarded as a vestigial organ, and that idea that it was vestigial basically retarded scientific research on the appendix for about a century. And we now know that it's part of the gut-associated lymphoid tissue, and of course you can survive without it. but I can also survive without my right arm, Father, but I'd really like to keep it. It's kind of
Well
important,
said.
you know. Um,
So maybe you could, I mean, I also mentioned the notion of eugenics, which is tied to evolution, of course, that
right.
somehow there are desirable sort of traits that you want to bring about in a species, the human race, and probably eliminate those things which aren't undesirable according to at least a rational sort of look at things according to them. Uh,
Right.
so again, how would that not just tied to evolution, but maybe tied to vaccines as well?
Sure. So the evolutionary worldview is considered by many to have led to the idea of eugenics and led to the eugenics movement that began in the late 1800s in England. And natural scientists were basically working, like you said, to improve the genetics of lots of things, of crop plants, of animals. Dogs were a particularly interesting subject. They really, a lot of the dog breeds have their roots in the this idea of eugenics from the late 1800s. And even humans were thought to be modifiable using rigorous programs of selective breeding. So what the eugenicists ended up doing is pushing organisms to the limits of their genetic variability. And you see this particularly with dog breeds. If you look at a purebred dog, certain kinds of dogs, they have trouble breathing. Other kinds of dogs have congenital hip problems or congenital problems with hormones or mutations that cause certain diseases and things like that. When you try with our limited human intellect to improve something, what we end up doing, because again, we're taking things out of the context of the whole, we end up introducing unexpected side effects, if you will. So as you're pushing an organism towards what you're desiring, you're also carrying along other baggage with that, if you will. And this kind of research, this eugenic research, is still being done with genetically modified organisms. And one of the ones that was very popular when I got interested in science about 20 years ago was golden rice, which is rice that's been modified to express beta carotene, which is a precursor to vitamin A. And it was supposed to remedy nutrient deficiencies in countries where rice was a primary part of their diet. But it turns out that in a lot of these places, they had other ways of remedying vitamin A deficiency and other things they normally ate. So it was a little bit of a disappointment. But vaccines are... they can be used as part of this eugenic movement, this idea that we can modify organisms. And the primary way that I'm aware of is the birth control vaccine that the World Health Organization has been trying to develop for a number of years. And they've discovered that using HCG in conjunction with tetanus toxoid can have a sterilizing effect. And this vaccine was deployed in Kenya just recently, in I think the past 5 years, and targeted to women of childbearing age. And similar vaccine campaigns have also been conducted in the Philippines and a couple of other third world countries. And there's also the use of the oral polio vaccine in third world countries. I mean, we know that the oral polio vaccine causes polio. There's more cases of polio-derived vaccine in the world right now than there is wild polio. And yet we're still willing to give it to people that are, considered by most of the Enlightenment elite to be lower class because they're, not as important. And there are a number of vaccine trials that have actually gotten moved into third world countries and had spectacularly bad effects. Gardasil, in particular, comes to mind. The phase 3 trials of Gardasil were being conducted in India, and there were a number of young women who are now permanently damaged from that. And so, I think, and I try not to talk about Bill Gates too much, Father, because I don't like to get too political. My area of expertise is science and not politics or corruption or any of those things. But he did say that with better vaccines, we can reduce the overall world population. So that does have a rather eugenic ring to it.
It does, and as if somehow the ability to bring forth children, give birth, is somehow a sickness that has to be vaccinated.
Right.
It's a strange thing. I think this would lead into something you know and have done a lot of research about, because you have ideologues who think that we can improve upon what the good Lord has given to us in terms of human nature, because it's all, you know, sort of a random chance sort of way that we came about anyway, so that we can manipulate. When you have these ideologues who are, let's say, pushing the notion of vaccinations as the only way that we can truly be safe, the state sometimes becomes involved, and you have potentially ideologues becoming tyrants who are going to either force vaccinations, which has happened in the past, and you'll go through this, I hope.
Right.
Or what might happen in maybe a more sort of a liberal environment is that, oh, we won't force you, but we'll make you filled with shame because you have decided to have blood in your hands, endangering your children, endangering the entire race of humanity. And so I think that's important to kind of maybe go through a little bit of that, how ideologues have become tyrants and the ideology of vaccinating becomes forced.
Right. Sure. So I kind of put together a little bit of a timeline regarding mandatory vaccinations, because I think most people are unaware that the vaccines have actually been protested from the very beginning, Father. It's really quite an interesting history. So it starts out in 1798 or thereabouts, which is when Jenner published his paper that claimed that he could generate lifelong immunity from smallpox using his vaccination, which, as we know, was cowpox, and the word vaccination itself comes from the Latin word for cow. So by 1817, which is not quite 20 years later, the London Medical Repository Monthly Journal and Review reported that the rate of smallpox among the vaccinated is alarmingly great. So already they were noticing that, hey, actually we're seeing a lot more disease among people that are vaccinated than we should. And 2 years later, the Edinburgh Medical and Surgical Journal reported that wherever vaccination has been introduced, the cases of failures are now increased to an alarming proportion. And by the early 1900s, if not earlier, it was already recommended to vaccinate for smallpox up to once a year, because the lifelong immunity was not working out for them. So in the meantime, in 1853, vaccination of infants for smallpox became mandatory in England, and the consequences for not vaccinating your child were sometimes fines, but all the way up to incarceration. So they would arrest you if you didn't vaccinate your child. And then in 1866, the first anti-compulsory vaccination league was founded by Richard Gibbs in England. And this was kind of in anticipation of a law that was then passed the next year in 1867, which extended mandatory vaccination to 14-year-olds. And so we're still in England. We're basically in England until I switch over to America. So it's the next several points. But in 1871, 1872, there was particularly bad outbreaks of smallpox, and a city called Leicester in England saw what they described as fearful mortality from smallpox. And this was despite the fact that almost everybody in Leicester was vaccinated and supposedly protected from the disease. So about 10 years later, public opposition to vaccination has been growing in the meantime because of this particular outbreak. Arrests in Leicester for defying the Vaccination Act were up to 1,100 individuals a year. So that was quite a bit. And as I said before, fines were also implemented. And according to Dr. Suzanne Humphreys, who writes about all of this in her book, Dissolving Illusions, she says that the penalties fell disproportionately on the poor, who, if they could not afford to pay the fine for noncompliance with the vaccination law, would have the settlement forcibly offset by seizure and sale of their furniture. So, it's kind of ironic that this idea of mandatory vaccination is also, it hits against one of the main themes of the people who are supporting the mandatory vaccination are also often supporting not disproportionately disadvantaging the poor. So it's a little bit contradictory there. But then in 1883, a couple years later, and this is just one specific example, I'm sure there were many, but a man by the name of Arthur Ward already had 2 children that had been vaccine injured from the smallpox vaccine, and he refused to submit his third for a vaccination. So the police showed up for the fine money while Mr. Ward was out, and his wife didn't have it. So they confiscated all the downstairs furniture, insisted on being allowed upstairs, which she didn't let them do, and then berated her and frightened her to the point that the shock of it all caused her to go into early labor, according to the news report. And the child that she gave birth to was stillborn, and she herself died a few weeks later. So that was a particularly tragic case of what did happen, at least in one case, when someone refused to submit to vaccination. So 2 years later, in March, there was a tremendous demonstration in Leicester, and the estimates were that between 80 and 100,000 people were protesting the Vaccine Act, and the procession of all the protesters was about 2 miles long. And as of that date in 1885 in March, over 5,000 people in Leicester had been issued a summons for being in violation of the Vaccine Act. And that demonstration drew protesters from all over the country, not just from Leicester. And I thought it was interesting that one of the things that Dr. Humphreys notes is that present at the demonstration was Spencer T. Hall, who had been vaccine injured at 2 years old after a smallpox vaccination, but he suffered an actual attack of the disease at 14, and after that, his health actually improved. So you're seeing, anecdotally, but what I've been trying to kind of explain all along, which is that the normal response of the body to disease is actually better for the body than this artificial exposure is. So around that time, the local government of Leicester was replaced by new folks who opposed vaccination instead of supporting it. And by 1887, which is 2 years later, vaccination rates for smallpox had fallen to about 10%. And again, according to Dr. Humphreys, the medical profession proclaimed that Leicester residents would suffer greatly for their decision to turn their backs on vaccination. They prognosticated that this unvaccinated town, with its highly flammable material, would suffer with the dread disease that would spread like wildfire on a prairie and decimate the population. And a number of those things I just said were actually things that she's quoting from articles at the time. So I would like to let a gentleman of the time speak for himself. This is quoted in a different book called Vaccine Injuries by Louis Conti and Tony Lyons. And they talk about John Thomas Biggs, who was a sanitary engineer and a member of the Leicester Town Council, an alderman, a magistrate, and a member of the Derwent Valley Water Board. And he kept meticulous records on the smallpox epidemic of 1871 to 1873. That's the one that kicked all of this off in Leicester. And he published his findings in 1912. And he says, a new method for which great practical utility is claimed has been enforced by the Sanitary Committee of the Corporation for the stamping out of smallpox. And the chairman of the committee has gone so far as to declare that smallpox is one of the least troublesome diseases with which they have to deal. The method of treatment, in a word, is this. As soon as smallpox breaks out, the medical man and the householder are compelled under penalty to at once report the outbreak to the corporation. The smallpox van is at once ordered by telephone to proceed to the house in question. The hospital authorities are also instructed by telephone to make all arrangements, and thus, within a few hours, the sufferer is safely in the hospital. The family and inmates of the house are placed in quarantine in comfortable quarters, and the house thoroughly disinfected. The result is that in every instance, the disease has been promptly and completely stamped out at a paltry expense. Use plenty of water, eat good food, live in light and airy houses, and see that the corporation kept the streets clean and the drains in order. If such details were attended to, there was no need to fear smallpox. So basically what they did was practiced improved sanitation, improved hygiene, and quarantine measures for individuals that were infected or exposed to individuals that were infected. And they saw much lower rates of smallpox than other towns that were highly vaccinated. So there are other ways to deal with disease. And this was kind of the great experiment, if you will, in bucking mandatory vaccination. And at the time, the vaccine proponents said, yep, it's all going to go, you know where in a handbasket. And it turns out it didn't. So continuing along with our timeline, in 1896, William Tebb became the president of England's National Anti-Vaccination League, and he was prosecuted and fined 13 times for refusing to vaccinate his daughter. And his visits to the U.S. are what started the U.S. Anti-Vaccination League. So we're going to jump across to the United States. where about 9 years later, there's a famous Supreme Court case, and I know this has probably been cited, and a number of people have expressed concern about a high-profile lawyer whose name I'm not remembering right now, who talked about mandatory vaccination not being in violation of the Constitution. And so this decision in 1905 is Jacobson versus Massachusetts. And Jacobson had been, and his son both had severe reactions to the smallpox vaccine. And the court ruled that they were still required to get the vaccine that was currently being mandated by law in Massachusetts. And a quote from that court case is as follows: "It is within the police power of a state to enact a compulsory vaccination law, and it is for the legislature and not for the courts to determine in the first instance whether vaccination is or is not the best mode for the prevention of smallpox and the protection of the public health." So the case has been made that this particular case is an example of utilitarianism that's being used to justify vaccines, and susceptible minorities like Jacobson and his son are being sacrificed for what's considered the greater good, which in this case would be the elimination of the spread of smallpox. But as the Leicester example proves, there are other ways to do that. And also, at the time that this was being done, often smallpox epidemics were associated with vaccination, so vaccination could start them rather than stop them. And the argument has been made that this Jacobson versus Massachusetts ruling actually paved the way for another ruling called Buff versus Bell in 1927, and this allowed the passage of eugenics laws in many places in the U.S., and it gave a green light for what ended up resulting in forcible sterilization of as many as 60,000 Americans up to the late 1940s. So it's another way that vaccination is connected to eugenics. This idea of utilitarianism, that somehow the greater good overrules the individual's good. So I'd like to note at this point that while the law was mandatory and the Supreme Court upheld the idea of vaccines being mandatory, Jacobson actually did not get the vaccine even after the court ruling. He just had to pay a fine. So he paid a fine of $5 and did not have to be injected with smallpox. So this brings me to another important point, because I know a number of people are concerned about being force vaccinated. And the idea is that, somebody's going to kind of grab you and hold you down and jab you with a needle. And from what other lawyers have said that I've heard, this action actually qualifies as assault and battery. So this is something other than mandatory vaccination at this point. The law can require you to be vaccinated, but it does not appear that it can require that someone come and actually hold you down and stick you with a needle. So you can have a penalty if you refuse to comply, but I don't think there's a legal precedent for actually making you receive the vaccine. So that was comforting to me when I was doing this research. So in 1922, there was another case in Texas. And this time the individual was seeking redress for being denied entry into both public and private schools after refusing vaccination. And this person also lost. But again, they didn't have to receive the vaccine. They just were unable to attend the schools that they wanted to do. And by 1986 in the US, there were a number of vaccine injury cases. The vaccine manufacturers were being sued quite a bit, actually, and it was becoming a rather risky proposition to make vaccines. And so Congress enacted the National Childhood Vaccine Injury Act, which, despite its names, also covers adults. And this established the Vaccine Adverse Event Reporting System, abbreviated VAERS, and also the Vaccine Court. And the idea was that this would make it swifter and easier for parents and adults who were injured to seek redress for the injuries for themselves or their children, and be compensated accordingly without putting the manufacturers at risk. So this act really made manufacturers completely exempt from liability for vaccine injury, and the federal government assumed that liability through the Vaccine Court. And that the money for that system is paid as a tax on every vaccine that's injected. It's about 75 cents, I think, per vaccine. So in 1995, about 9 years later, the Department of Health and Human Services Secretary, who at the time was Donna Shalala, if I'm saying that right, gave the Social Security Administration the right to reveal the Social Security number of newborn infants to state health department officials for use in a vaccine tracking registry. So the groundwork has actually already been laid a long time ago for a national vaccine registry where you would be tracked as to your vaccine status. But I didn't find anything else updated on that in the research that I did this week as to whether that has been initiated or not. So there's a hole in my timeline there. It only goes up to 1995, and that's a while ago. But that's kind of the general history of the idea of mandated vaccines or mandatory vaccines. And as of right now, vaccine laws are pretty much in the hands of the states. And when it comes to school attendance, so vaccination isn't necessarily mandatory in the sense that, you can't get out of your physician's office without getting a vaccine, but you can potentially get denied admittance into schools or daycares. And all states allow medical exemptions to this mandate. And so those are, if you have an allergic reaction to a component of the vaccine, or you've had a serious adverse reaction to a vaccine in the past or something like that, you can get a medical exemption. 15 states allow what's called philosophical exemptions. So these are exemptions that you can just say, I'm personally opposed to vaccines. And so from eastish to westish, those states are Pennsylvania, Ohio, Minnesota, Wisconsin, Michigan, North Dakota, Louisiana, Arkansas, Texas, Oklahoma, Arizona, Colorado, Utah, Idaho, and Oregon. And all but 5 states allow religious exemptions. So you can claim that your religion will not allow you to get vaccines. Now, that's not really a claim that a Catholic can make so much because of our religion does not oppose vaccination in general, but you could potentially make it at least for the aborted fetal cells. I think that would be reasonable if that's a distinction that can be made. But so those are allowed in all states except for California, Mississippi, Maine, West Virginia, and New York. And so I was also asked this week at some point, what about compulsory vaccination for healthcare workers? Like, how does that work? And state immunization laws for most states, including the one that we live in and the ones that we border, do not actually require vaccination. But individual hospitals are permitted to require it as a condition of employment. And since most of this falls under at-will employment, there's not really a direct avenue of redress for an individual with like a philosophical exemption kind of thing. There has been some legal redress through lobbying with the nurses union. But even with that, an NBC News report recently, as recent as 2017, basically reported that when employers require a vaccine, the CDC found that 85% of the workers get one. So I thought that was interesting. It's required, but still 15% of people are opting out. So there must be some kind of way to do that, but I'm not sure. That would probably depend on which exact organization you were employed by, and you'd have to do a little digging on your own for a specific disease. And I also just kind of wanted to note in terms of mandatory vaccination of healthcare workers, it's supposed to, prevent spread of disease, and healthcare workers are exposed to a lot of disease. But there are other things that could also be very helpful in preventing spread of disease, and one of them is hand washing. And the CDC has stated, without giving a real statistic, that in terms of a number, that healthcare workers clean their hands less than half as often as they should. And simply increasing hand washing would probably do more to reduce disease spread than 100% compliance with vaccination. But that's not the avenue that's being pursued currently.
Very good. Well, that's an excellent history, Pam, of really what is largely a civil liberties question too. Obviously, religious exemptions you mentioned and things like that, but the notion of forced vaccinations, at least in the past, through various legislative acts like the Vaccination Act and sanitary boards, very, very sort of big government sort of promoting and pushing this. But it's not just a question of civil liberties, I think. I think you're also saying that there's potential consequences. That this is a healthcare question too. The best way to deal with the well-being of the human person and their immune system. So we're getting into a very, very, I think, a touchy topic. Some of the consequences of vaccination. And is there a connection between vaccinations and things like autism, autoimmune deficiencies? And I think, whenever I look at a CDC website or some other sort of agency's website, they'll always say there is absolutely no evidence regarding the connection with vaccines and autism. Or they'll say, well, yeah, there was a paper that came out, but it was retracted that was showing the connection, but the person had to take it back. But then I was mentioned to Pam, and I failed to get her the copy, but I believe it was even in the month of May or as early as March, where the CDC admitted, and it was on its website, that there is no direct evidence that vaccines do not cause autism either. So when they say there's no vaccines never cause this, they don't know.
Right.
So that's
yeah,
a most way. But if you could look into that, or rather speak to that.
Sure.
Question.
Most of the studies actually that say that there's no link between vaccines and a particular adverse event, what they're really concluding is there's insufficient evidence to establish a link. But what people don't realize, because it's not explicitly stated in the conclusion, is that usually means that there's also insufficient evidence to establish there's not a link. And a negative is a very, very difficult thing to demonstrate using empirical evidence. And so you cannot say that the scientific evidence has demonstrated that there's no link. That's just something that based on the way empiricism works, you can't prove it. You can say that the link has not been supported up to this point conclusively, but that doesn't mean that it's been disproven. So there's some semantic problems with the way that some of this is presented. So another semantic distinction that's important to make is just when you think about autism is a behavioral diagnosis, not a medical diagnosis. So it's a cluster of symptoms that are generally behavioral, and there's not really, it's not like you can do a brain scan on somebody or a genetic screening on somebody and say, oh yes, this person has the biological markers of autism. So it's a little bit kind of disingenuous to say, to talk about vaccines causing or not causing autism from a biological perspective. But we do know that vaccines can cause encephalopathy, and so this is inflammation in the brain. And then we also know that inflammation in the brain can result in autism like behavioral symptoms. And so there is a kind of an indirect link there that's very well established. I mean, the Vaccine Injury Court accepts encephalopathy as a possible adverse event for certain vaccines, if not all vaccines. So there's a number of kind of cases that have been made for the link with vaccines and autism. And it's interesting that I'm sitting here talking about this tonight, Father, because when I first got started researching vaccines, I was like, I'm not touching autism. I'm not going near it. I'm not looking into that question. I'm going to look at all the other possible questions, but I don't want to touch this one because it's so political and it's such a hot topic. But I have to. It's something that I think there's a good enough case that's being made for some of these risks that it's worth looking at. So two of the ingredients that are included in vaccines are potential neurotoxins, and those two are thimerosal, which is a preservative, and aluminum, which is an adjuvant. So I'm going to talk about thimerosal first. And Bobby Kennedy Jr. has actually published a book on thimerosal. It's very well referenced from what I know. And he talks about how thimerosal was removed from 3 childhood vaccines in 2003, and this was kind of in spite of the fact that the government was protesting that it was safe and wouldn't cause any harm. But it was added to multi-dose vials of the flu vaccine in greater amounts than was actually removed from the schedule. So if you're getting the flu vaccine each year, especially as a child, you're getting more thimerosal than you were getting before it was removed from vaccines in 2003. So he also points out that the thimerosal is recognized to be a biohazard. In some states, the doctors must evacuate the building and call an actual hazmat team if one of these vials of multi-dose flu vaccine is dropped and it breaks. And the flu vaccines are treated themselves as hazardous waste. And one of the reasons for this is the toxic dose of mercury is considered to be 200 parts per billion. And, part per billion is fairly low, so mercury is fairly toxic. And an acceptable level in drinking water is about 2 parts per billion. And the dose that's given in vaccines is 50,000 parts per billion. So this is not doing my math wonderfully at the moment, but
it's pretty toxic.
What's that?
It's pretty toxic.
About 250 times the toxic dose. And so I actually went and looked up the MSDS myself, because being the consummate skeptic that I am, I never like to just take people's word for it. And so, and the MSDS is the material safety data sheet. There's one of these available for every chemical under the sun. And they just kind of tell you what's associated with it in terms of hazards and how it should be used and flammability and things like that. And so it rates as a 2 on the health hazard, which is hazardous. And it's hazardous in the case of skin contact, eye contact, ingestion, and inhalation. And severe overexposure can result in death. It's mutagenic for mammalian somatic cells, or that is body cells. It's toxic to kidneys, to the central nervous system, It may be toxic to the liver and the spleen. Repeated or prolonged exposure to the substance can produce target organ damage, and repeated exposure to a highly toxic material may produce general deterioration of health by an accumulation in one or many human organs. And this is all directly from the material safety data sheet. So I didn't make this up, and neither did the anti-vaccine activists. This is not a joke as a chemical. It's pretty serious, and it does say that in the case of a large spill, you're not supposed to touch it, and you need to call assistance for disposal. So that pretty well validates what he says. But the particular part of interest to us here when we're talking about autism is the central nervous system damage. And so what's seen in children that develop symptoms of autism is some kind of central nervous system damage. And it manifests itself in slightly different ways depending on the level of damage, and it's been linked to mutations or to chemical exposures or to genetics, and we'll kind of look at some of that genetic side here in just a second. But certainly thimerosal is a chemical exposure that can cause central nervous system damage, and so I don't think it can be ruled out as a possible triggering agent in the development of autism. Now, obviously not all kids develop autism from vaccination, because there are a lot of kids that don't have it. But just to kind of put things in perspective, I was talking earlier, people were worried about rabies, and I was talking earlier about there are about 30 to 60,000 cases of rabies per year in the US, and about 1 to 3 deaths. But there are, as of 2016, so the birth year 2016, there were about 1 in 54 kids were diagnosed with autism from that birth year. There were a little over 3.1 million kids that were born. That makes a little over 70,000 kids with autism. That is a lot of kids with autism. And if vaccines are triggering this or involved in this in any way, it's something we really need to be serious about. So the second material that's been implicated in the development of autistic symptoms is the aluminum adjuvants, which are also known to be neurotoxic. And so I looked up the MSDS on aluminum oxyhydroxide and aluminum hydrophosphate. sulfate or hydroxyphosphate sulfate. I've made a typo there, so I'm not sure which one it is. And both of these have pretty clean MSDSs. They're on record as not being harmful. So why are we worried about them in vaccines? Well, most of the time that you're exposed to aluminum, it's through the skin or the oral route, and aluminum is extremely poorly absorbed through both of those routes. So this is something very different than injecting aluminum in your body. So I went looking for an indication of what is a safe dose or considered a safe dose of aluminum that's received parenterally, which is a scientific word for basically not through the mouth. So if you're gonna insert aluminum in the body, levels of about 4 to 5 micrograms per kilogram per day are considered, that's kind of the top level for patients that have either impaired kidney that have impaired kidney function, and that includes premature babies. And so this is kind of the lowest maximum safe dose. And this is on the FDA's website, and it's particularly given for if you have to have intravenous nourishment. Those solutions often contain aluminum, and so they have to have less than a certain number of micrograms or milligrams of aluminum, and you have to give it to the person at a rate that's lower than what I said here. So just for kind of reference, a microgram is a thousandth of a milligram, and it's a millionth of a gram, and a paperclip weighs about a gram. So we're talking about a millionth of a paperclip worth of something when we talk about a microgram. So this is adjusted for body size, so it's in micrograms per kilogram. So an infant would receive, in that case, kind of a much higher dose than you or I would receive because they're much smaller. So the average infant weighs about 3.3 kilograms, and that would mean that about, if we take the upper limit, so about 16.5 micrograms of aluminum would be what's considered a safe dose for a baby. And again, this is for patients with impaired kidney function, so maybe slightly higher than that could be safe, but this is the only established in the literature safe rate that I could find. So again, about 15, 16 micrograms of aluminum. Sorry, I don't know if I said grams before. It's getting late at night. So 15 to 16 micrograms of aluminum. The hepatitis B vaccine, which is given at birth, Father, contains 250 micrograms of aluminum. So that's significantly higher than the rate that is considered acceptable in infants. And so I think one of the reasons this is probably maybe kind of passed over is, well, if you average it out, they're still receiving less than the 4 to 5 micrograms per kilogram per day. But the problem with arguing that is that your body can only eliminate aluminum so fast. In fact, your body's not very efficient at eliminating aluminum. So if you're injecting loads of aluminum into an infant who's going to be even less efficient because their kidneys aren't, fully developed as an adult, that can truly be a problem. And at 2 months of age, when babies are about 5.5 kilograms, they receive 1,225 micrograms of aluminum. So this is an extremely high amount of aluminum for somebody that tiny, and this is nobody's really tested this in infants. I mean, for ethical reasons, you don't want to inject babies with a known neurotoxin and then do an experiment on that. So it's kind of curious to note, though, that the U.S. has an extremely high rate of newborn deaths for an industrialized country. And there are folks who think that there's a relationship between the injection of aluminum here with that problem. So, but there's another, and then of course, aluminum is neurotoxic. It can cause the kind of brain inflammation that is also associated with autism. And there's another possible biological mechanism for causing autism through vaccination, and that's fetal DNA. And this is research done by Dr. Teresa Deischer, and I highly, highly recommend her. She's working with Sound Choice Pharmaceuticals. I believe she founded it, and she's done research that shows that autism rates rise with the introduction of each new aborted fetal cell-derived vaccine. So not necessarily with each new vaccine, but with each one that's manufactured in aborted fetal cells. And she's looked at countries in Europe that pulled some of the vaccines after the initial autism scare that was from that paper that you mentioned. By the way, that paper was published by Andrew Wakefield in the Lancet, the journal The Lancet, and it was retracted, but it was not retracted because the Lancet published any problem with his research, but because there was an undisclosed conflict of interest, which is not great, but that's not even nearly equivalent to saying, oh, his research has been debunked. And in fact, there are researchers who have replicated what he did, and there are researchers who tried to replicate what he did and not seen it, and there are conflicts of interest there as well. Generally, the negative studies are funded by vaccine manufacturers, and the positive studies are funded by people who have ideological ties to not vaccinating. So there's a lot of conflict of interest going on in this, and it's not clear what exactly the etiology is here, but Dr. Deisher does a really good job of explaining it, looking at these fetal cell-derived vaccines. So these countries in Europe pulled the vaccines after the Wakefield paper was published, and then they reintroduced them later after it was discredited. And what happened is their autism rates dropped when they pulled the vaccines, and they rose again after reintroduction. And this is the closest we are ever going to get to an experiment on looking at rates of autism and their link to vaccines. And this happened in more than one country. And so she proposes a biological mechanism that's actually well documented in the literature for why this would happen. And so it's known that in some cases of autism, children develop what's called de novo mutations. These are new mutations that are not present in either parent. And we know that if you introduce DNA into cells in the laboratory, that if the DNA is homologous, that is, if it's similar to the original DNA, they can kind of line up and then switch places. So this is called homologous recombination, and it can cause the DNA that's in solution to be incorporated into the DNA that's present in the cells. And the fetal contaminant DNA in the chickenpox vaccine, particularly, it actually exceeds the amount of chickenpox material that's in the vaccine as an active ingredient. So we know that there's fetal DNA in these aborted fetal-derived vaccines, and we know that fetal DNA at the concentrations it's present in the vaccines can cause mutations. And so this is a plausible biological mechanism. And it also has a dose response. So as she noted when she was doing her research, and the CDC has actually changed the way it reports certain things, so she can't keep doing it, which is also rather curious. I don't want to get into any conspiracy theories here, Father, but it's curious. But she's established that there's a biological gradient there. So like the more aborted fetal cell-derived vaccines I have, the more autism I have. And the Bradford Hill criteria for establishing an epidemiologic cause of a disease, biological gradient is actually an important criteria, and a biological mechanism is as well. And it's interesting that many people say, well, the idea that vaccines and autism are linked, it's correlation, not causation, but temporality is the only one of the 9 Bradford Hill criteria that's absolutely necessary to establish causation. And so it's curious that people just kind of dismiss that with a wave of hand, like, well, it was temporally related to the vaccine, but it couldn't possibly be caused by the vaccine. Well, temporality is the only thing that's absolutely necessary to establish causation. And then, as I mentioned to you, Father, there have actually been cases where the vaccine court has awarded injuries in instances of autism. And the most famous is a little girl named Hannah Poling. And she had 5 vaccines at 19 months old. And prior to that, she was interactive, playful, and communicative. And 2 days later, she was lethargic, irritable, and feverish. She developed a chickenpox rash after 10 days. And she was diagnosed with encephalopathy, which was linked to a mitochondrial enzyme deficit. So people want to dismiss this case by saying, well, she had an underlying problem and that's why she developed autism. It wasn't because of the vaccine. But she clearly didn't have autism prior to her 5 injections, and she did afterwards. And so one of the things that's overlooked in the vaccine autism debate is that we don't have a single cause for autism. I'm not saying that every child that has autism has it because they've been vaccinated, and I don't think anybody else out there is saying that either. But there are environmental triggers that can, and we know this just across the board in all living things, there are environmental triggers that can cause the way that your DNA is expressed to change. And this is called epigenetics. And if you're never exposed to that environmental trigger, you will never develop the disease or the symptoms. And so it's not legitimate, I think, to just dismiss vaccination as a possible cause, just because you're saying, okay, well, there was an underlying cause and that's the real cause. Well, the vaccine was the efficient cause. You know, it was the thing that was right there happening, causing to bring it about. So I've talked a lot, Father. I'm sorry.
Sure, no, I appreciate that. That's very helpful. Lots of circumstantial sort of evidence, some connections, anecdotal, but also some research has been done that seems to be an increase in autism with the increase of the use of vaccines derived from fetal tissue cells.
Right.
But I want to, and we have to kind of maybe do this a bit more quick here.
Okay.
Again, the vaccines, you have stated, do not always treat the immune system of the human being in a holistic way. Right. It might excite the producing of a lot of antibodies to go after the antigens and the pathogens and so forth that come into the body, but it's sort of an artificialized excitement of the immune system so that maybe it's not fully engaged. So with that in mind, the immune system seems to be not properly used. So would vaccines perhaps harm the immune system in some way because it's sort of exciting it to do something that it's not being attacked? I mean, it doesn't have a disease, but it's being purposely excited. Does it cause your immune system maybe even to start attacking you, the autoimmune deficiencies? And like I said, maybe a quick, like 3 or 4 minute overview. Sorry about that.
Yes, I will be quick.
But maybe just a quick overview, and because and people say, boy, there's a lot more diabetes than I remember growing up. There's a lot more of this. There's a lot more of that, and I wonder. So tell us just very quickly.
Okay, sure. So there's an underlying mechanistic link between the development of allergies and autoimmunity. And right now I'll go ahead and refer readers or listeners to a book called Vaccine Illusion, and I can't pronounce the name of the author. But her first name's Tatiana and her last name starts with an O. And she talks about how the response that you see in vaccination is actually much more akin to allergy than it is to real immunity, and particularly with this idea that you're sensitized to the antigen on the first exposure, so that's the first vaccine, and then you get the boosters, which causes a greater response. And so we see that with allergic reactions developing. You don't usually have a prophylactic response to the very first exposure. You have to be exposed to it, sensitized to it, and then your body will react. And so it's interesting to note that one of the things I learned while I was researching this, Father, is that actually the first case of hay fever was described in 1828, and the first real studies done on allergies were done in the 1870s. And the disease itself, or allergic reactions themselves, were not well recognized until the 1900s. And the case has been made that the hypodermic needle, which was introduced in 1853, had a lot to do with the development of environmental allergies once we started injecting things underneath the skin, because they were coming into the body in ways that weren't normal. But also, once we started adding adjuvants to vaccines, I actually kind of make a mental note on that a while back. Aluminum adjuvants, which we just mentioned, are also neurotoxic. They're broad spectrum, so they can cause you to have an immune response to a variety of things. And there are a number of studies that have demonstrated a connection between either oral or non-oral administration of aluminum. And that can cause animals to become allergic to foods that they're consuming at the same time that they're being either eating the aluminum or being injected with the aluminum. And so there's a logical biological mechanism that links aluminum adjuvants and allergies. And then autoimmune progressions, there's a lot we don't understand about autoimmune progression. And I think part of the problem is that we're looking at diseases like multiple sclerosis and type 1 diabetes and lupus and arthritis, like they're all different diseases, but really the underlying etiology is the same. There's a breakdown in the recognition of self versus non-self, and it's only the part of the body to which the sensitization occurs that is different. So there's been described in the literature this something called the autoimmune inflammatory syndrome induced by adjuvants, is abbreviated ASIA, and this is a controversial claim. It's been dismissed by those that claim that the definition is too broad and it doesn't explain the diversity of symptoms. But the diversity of symptoms isn't really a problem because the etiology of the disease is the same, the cause of the disease is the same. Your body is attacking itself. It's just attacking different parts of itself in those different diseases. So in MS, it's attacking the myelin around your nerves, and lupus is attacking your own DNA, and diabetes, it's attacking your pancreatic cells that produce insulin. But it's still the immune system that's doing the attacking. And so similar sorts of things can mediate autoimmunity as well as allergies. This could be a problem of training the body through vaccination to produce B cell reactions. It could be a problem with the adjuvants that, you're introducing an adjuvant and that's causing an abnormally strong immune response. And so something that wouldn't normally react with the tissues in your body will, under those circumstances, react with the tissues in their body. And autoimmune diseases are another recognized adverse event reaction with vaccines, particularly Guillain-Barré syndrome, which is a degenerative neurologic disease. And there are a couple of other autoimmune diseases that are recognized as being connected with vaccines as well.
Very good. So again, if you fool around with the immune system a little too much, it might turn on the very person who's trying to protect.
Right.
So I want to take some questions at this time. If people have some questions they want to write in, obviously it's a wonderful presentation by Pam. Lots of wonderful information, especially about the history of vaccination acts, England, the United States, the notion of forced vaccinations, some of the sort of protections in that regard. Then also the connection potentially with autism and autoimmune disorders, and sort of the ideologies behind it. And of course, as we take questions, and again, people please write some questions in, part of the Enlightenment sort of notion is to sort of remake humanity and into something better, stronger than it was, and so to somehow overcome the fall, to somehow produce Eden once again on earth. And
right,
we have to understand that this notion of a paradise returning in a risk-free environment in which all disease, a war on poverty, a war on drugs, a war on all viruses, it's something that we live in a fallen world, and we're offered the gift of eternal life and the resurrection of the body that might have to be buried because of death. So there's some questions that I see. So Pam, let me go through some of these with you.
Sure.
The first one, this is a good one because, and I wonder if the CDC has made any adjustments regarding this. The question was, how do they referring to the vaccinators and medical sort of people, justify giving any vaccines to a baby before their immune systems are even fully developed?
I think the primary justification is that the infants are susceptible to the disease. So last time we talked about measles and vaccination with measles rendering people more susceptible, or infants more susceptible, because there's no longer protective maternal antibodies being passed through the breast milk. And so people have seen, there's a susceptibility in this age group, so we should really give them a vaccination. And it goes down to that ideology that you talked about at the beginning, Father. I mean, the ideology is we can protect everybody with the vaccines, and we can tinker with nature, and everything will be okay. And so it just, I think it's ideological. I don't think there's not scientific evidence supporting infant vaccination in terms of its safety or efficacy, because those tests just aren't done in infants, because that would, like I said, be unethical. And their immune systems aren't fully developed, and that's one of the problems that we're seeing, I think, in terms of the complete retraining of the immune system. There's some articles that have been published on the flu in particular. One of them was called "Your First Flu is Forever," and basically the idea is that the first exposure you get to the flu, particularly, it shapes your immune response to the flu for the rest of your life. So if your first exposure is a vaccine, that could have problematic effects that we just can't even imagine at this point.
Very good. Someone didn't really ask a question per se, but they mentioned that author, The Vaccine Illusion by Tatiana. Do you know how to pronounce that last
No,
name?
I don't.
Obukhunk. For those who are interested, perhaps if people have access to the Q&A box, there is a link.
No, I don't think they do, Father. That may be something we need to email out.
So maybe the person who wrote in that link could maybe put in the chat. Would it work if we put it on the chat box, perhaps?
I think you could put it on the chat, as long as the chat can go to all participants,
link,
all attendees.
Give it to all sort of participants, all attendees.
I think I can do that, actually.
Okay, great. And while you're typing that in, the last question that we received tonight had to do with, we talked about the vaccinations and some of the problems with the shots received. Could it also be allergy shots? Can they also be problematic health-wise to your immune system or to your body in general?
So that is a question that I am actually not 100% sure how to answer. That's
okay.
I know I've heard some things kind of both ways, and it's not something I've directly done research on, so I don't like to comment on things that I haven't thoroughly researched.
Well, when Pam doesn't know it, I don't know who does, right?
That's maybe a little bit of an overstatement.
So we're getting towards the end, and Pam is obviously a member of our parish, and so people might have questions that they may not have been able to ask this evening. So Pam, would it be all right if people just contact you in some way, or stop you on the way out of church one morning, or?
Yeah, no, I welcome questions at any point. I mean, and I don't expect people to take my word for all of this either. I mean, I think doing your own research is excellent if you're able to do that, and I'm happy to read anything that anybody sort of recommends as maybe you should think about this, or think about that. But I did want to, if we just have a couple more minutes, Father, just mention, I know some people were concerned about ways to minimize damage if you do end up being forced vaccinated or forced to vaccinate. And so I just wanted to just really quickly mention a few of those things.
Please do, yes.
Okay. So there's kind of all kinds of information circulating out there, and I'm not saying this is a comprehensive list. There are probably additional things you can do, but these are things that seem to be kind of a consensus across the board that people say make the damage less likely. So in the first place, do not ever get a vaccination if you are sick. So if you are sick, definitely make sure you put it off until you are well again, because that can cause severe immune interactions and can cause severe reactions. Do not take Tylenol preemptively. Tylenol it's debatable actually whether Tylenol is even safe. It's because of what it does in the body, and in terms of depleting glutathione levels and suppressing fever, which is a normal reaction of the immune system. It certainly is over-consumed. So don't do that before a vaccination. That can make the reaction worse. And don't take a vaccine while you're taking antibiotics. Taking probiotics can be helpful, but you'd need to consume these for about 2 months prior to and 3 months after a vaccination. Vitamin A and vitamin C are both helpful. I don't remember the dosage of vitamin A. I think it's just sort of a normal FDA recommendation, but the vitamin C dosage recommended is significantly higher than the FDA recommendation. I believe it was 4 grams in divided doses, so 4,000 milligrams. To be taken before and after for several days. And then just always, if you have to have a vaccine, make sure that the vaccine is being given in the correct part of the body in the correct manner. And that's one of my concerns about this warp speed operation, Father, is there's a number of vaccine injuries, particularly with the tetanus shot. If it's not given in the right place in the shoulder, it can cause severe shoulder damage because it can damage the nerves in the body, just the physical action of the needle, aside from all of the vaccine problems. So if you have to get a vaccine, make sure that you know where and how it should be given, and make sure that the person follows that procedure. So,
well, and of course, that was one of your sort of motivations, was to not only find ethical,
yeah, to avoid shots.
ethical versions, but didn't like the shots too much. But also,
no, not so much.
the thing is, it's more natural when people receive things, you said, through the respiratory system or orally. And so you talk about edible vaccines. And
yes, and interestingly, in the vaccine illusion, Father, she talks about a study that was done in the 1920s where they immunized guinea pigs for tetanus by feeding them tetanus spores, because tetanus doesn't infect you through the oral route, but the exposure to the spores allowed the immune system to kind of gain recognition of it. And then when the guinea pigs were wounded and then spores were put into the wounds, which is the normal way you get lockjaw or the symptoms of tetanus, then they were immune to it. And that immunity was strain specific, but it was an alternate form of inducing immunity to vaccination, but it wasn't pursued. It was one of those things that kind of just got left there on the table because it wasn't what was in the literature, as we talked a little bit about last time.
Just think how popular the doctor would be in the future if they have ethical vaccines which were somehow not harmful to the immune system, that were edible, and the children wouldn't have to take shots with sharp needles. So before we end, I want to get to this last question. Someone just wrote one in. The question is, which of the 49, I assume there are 49 CDC recommended vaccines, which of them would you consider safe? Or at least,
well, I think that's 49 doses, not 49 vaccines, but
okay. 49 doses.
You know, I've gotten asked a couple of times if there are any vaccines I would recommend, and really that is it's not even something that's necessarily legal for me to do because I'm not a medical practitioner. Right. So I am going to have to say, you know, take what you have, you know, learned about the impacts individually, but also, you know, sort of sociologically or societally, about vaccinations, and apply your own risk-benefit analysis. And the vaccine inserts indicate what possible side effects there are with the vaccine. And there are a couple of books that may have them sitting next to me, that talk about some of the ones that your doctor may not tell you about. And I found this one probably the most helpful. This is what your doctor may not tell you about children's vaccinations. So she deals with a lot of the adverse reactions, and then the vaccine book by Dr. Sears deals with some of them. I don't really 100% agree with Dr. Sears because he thinks that the HPV vaccine is safe, and I think that there is a huge amount of evidence that that is not true at all. I can say that all vaccines have risks associated with them. So if you're asked, the question is asking, you know, are any of them just perfectly, totally, completely safe and risk-free? No, they're not. Some of them are less reactive than others, though. I believe the Hib vaccine is one of the least reactive, and that's for Haemophilus influenza B. But that's also given to infants. So, you know, then again, you have that particular problem. Somebody in the comments is mentioning the Vaccine Friendly Plan by Paul Thomas. I don't recommend that book. I don't think. He has a lot of other interesting parenting advice that's a little bit strange in that book. He does have I think, a somewhat reasonable analysis of vaccines, but you can find the same information, I think better information, in the what your doctor may not tell you about children's vaccinations. So,
Pam, very good. Thank you for everything for last week as well. Having gone through, obviously, the notion of unethical versions of vaccines, which we spoke about, and how we really have to object to that. It's a duty, in fact. Mm-hmm. But also, then we moved on to say that vaccines themselves, there's going to be a lot of promises that are made, but not all those promises are delivered upon. And also there could be pretty much in every case some side effects, and some could be quite difficult. And
Right.
and of course, maybe some connection even with some autoimmune disorders or even autism. But, and of course, and then Pam, thank you for also going through the fact that the history of sort of both sort of these ideologues who have almost tyrannically imposed a vaccination culture upon us, but then there's always been, you told us, this notion of an anti-vax, which has become a pejorative term, unfortunately.
It has,
But
unfortunately.
the fact that there's always been opposition to this, because the good Lord gave us an immune system, and if you're not sick, and you don't, you're not doing things that would perhaps lend themselves to a great risk of getting sick in a particular way, that like babies, intravenous drug use is not going to happen with babies. So why are you giving that sort of vaccine? So many good things you've given to us, and we very much appreciate all your research. But maybe you could end, and I'll do a final prayer. But you have a paper which is becoming more of a book as we speak. If you could tell us, maybe not when, but sort of when it is eventually done, it will, where it will be available.
Yes. So I make no timeline promises, but I will say that the book has gone through, or is going through right now, its first round of questions and criticism from medical professionals. So that's a good step forward towards a final product. I have a couple of sections still to write on it, but that will be available through the Kolbe Center. And of course, those who are, in the parish are welcome to ask me if you forget where to find that. But that is going to be published through the Kolbe Center for the Study of Creation.
Wonderful. Thank you again, Pam, for all that you've done for us. And thank you for all those attendees at this Zoom presentation. And we'll continue with another Zoom presentation, probably on a lighter topic that I'll come up with. But thank you all for attending, and let's end with a prayer. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Ghost. Amen.
Amen.
Glory be to the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Ghost.
As it was in the beginning, is now, and ever shall be, world without end. Amen.
World without end. Amen. I'll give you final blessing through intercession of our Blessed Mother, good Saint Joseph, your guardian angels, the patron saints, benedictio Dei omnipotentis Patris et Filii, and Spiritus Sancti et super vos et maneat semper. Amen.
Amen.
God bless everybody. Thank you, Pam.
Thank you, God.